right, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Inshallah, today we're going to be discussing a very important topic, which is putting conditions on a marriage contract. And certainly, when we speak of marriage contracts, there's always going to be that question during the marriage contract: what kind of a condition can I actually put, or what it would be called a prenuptial agreement. That prenuptial agreement, how much of it is valid, how much of it is not valid, and what about the legal side of it? So we're going to do a couple comparisons here, and we're going to discuss different things thoroughly. We're going to discuss a couple things thoroughly just so that we understand our rights, right? And certainly when we're speaking about putting conditions in a marriage contract, we're actually discussing a huge debate between scholars, but you really have to pay attention to what we're going to say because today's class is really technical. So I want you to pay attention to in order to make sure that you basically have your, let's say, your marriage rights, and you have your at least what to you is important, and of course the conditions that relate to it are in place. So here we go. With the conditions in a marriage contract, we have to basically understand that there are several conditions in a marriage contract, and how we look at these conditions is basically going to determine the validity of such a contract or not. So therefore, the scholars had classified the types of marriage contracts first into three different categories. And they considered that we're looking at three different kinds. The first one is a condition that's parallel to the contract and the core of marriage in Islam. So we're looking at a condition where in itself, it basically goes with the essence of Islam. So in that situation, we're going to discuss some details. What if these conditions basically went against the essence of marriage in Islam? The second types of conditions are the conditions that contradict marriage in Islam and the main idea of marriage. So we're talking about a condition where it basically goes against the whole essence of marriage in Islam, or goes against the whole idea of what Islam considers is a core part or a core definition of what makes marriage. The third type of condition is that what Islam was idle on. So we're looking at types of conditions that Islam didn't necessarily say that this was okay or this was not okay, but Islam was just idle on. So what is the ruling basically on all of these types of conditions? So let's start with the first one. And in the first one, we're talking about the conditions parallel to the essence of the marriage contract in Islam and marriage in Islam. Like what? Well, just like if you're talking about putting a condition that the husband would be good to the wife, or that he would basically cover up the costs, or probably be a responsible husband, or be a nice husband, or be, a person of taqwa, a person of akhlaq. You're putting that in a marriage contract. I mean, that's already stated as part of what Islam regarded as part of the marriage contract anyways. So there's no doubt, there's no question, there's no debate on whether the man is supposed to fulfill the marriage contract or not. Now, one thing to say is that the main reason for all these, let's say, debates in regards to the marriage contract and the conditions is really mainly to support the weaker side. And who's the weaker side in this situation? It's basically the wife. She's the weaker side because usually she basically is the one that is going to be in obedience to the husband. She's going to be basically under his authority. So therefore, she's really trying to see a way that can support her rights without jeopardizing her life. So when we're talking about those kinds of marriage conditions, that he would be good, etc. Well, anyways, those are all already conditions that Islam had already asked the husband to fulfill. So he's obligated to fulfill them, and whether mentioned in the contract or not, he is asked to fulfill them. Okay. Now, the second piece of it is the conditions that contradict marriage in Islam and the idea or the essence of marriage. So what are we looking at? We're looking at, well, him or her, putting a condition that she doesn't want to obey him, or that she can leave the house without his permission, or that about in regards to fairness with the co-wives. How do we understand? Does he have to be fair, or can she say, well, I want you to basically favor me above them, or anything like that? Well, that contradicts the whole idea of marriage in Islam and the essence of marriage in Islam. And of course, other conditions like not have sexual relations or even once a year, or put a condition on the number of times, etc., then in that situation, that contradicts the essence of marriage contracts in Islam. In any condition that is against Islam or against the essence of Islam, whether we're speaking about the general definition or whether we're speaking about the details, whether in understanding marriage or understanding perhaps transactions or whatever, if it goes against what the actual essence of that definition or that side of definition in Islam, then in that situation, it would be contradicting Islam and contradicting the details and the parameters that Islam had regarded are basically the foundations of what makes the definition of marriage, or what makes the definition of a transaction, or whatever, and the list goes on and on. So what is the evidence on that? Well, the Prophet ﷺ basically said in the hadith, I want you to look at this one. The Prophet ﷺ said, كل شرط ليس في كتاب الله فهو باطل. Every condition that contradicts the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is invalid. Well, what do you mean by contradicting the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So we're talking about contradicting in the general terms, or in the essence, or in the legal maxims, or in the details. So when we speak about Kitab Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we see in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that there are certain general terms in the Quran that may not have been at least given all the details in the Quran itself, but they were given details in Sunnah. That's number one. Number two, so we've got general terms, we've got certain details. There are certain details that were given in the Quran and not given in the Sunnah. And there are certain details given in the Quran and not necessarily other details. So in that situation, we would look at the resources, and that's basically شرط ليس في كتاب الله or شرط في كتاب الله. It's a condition in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or a condition that's not in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we say في كتاب الله, we're not necessarily just talking about Quran per se, but we're talking about anything that relates to wahy. So whether we're speaking about Quran or whether we're speaking about Sunnah, all of that would be considered as fi kitabillah, and it doesn't have to be specific to just being Quran, meaning an ayah in the actual Quran, okay? But it could be just a general thing that it includes anything that was as what is considered as part of what Muhammad ibn Abdullah had taught as part of Islam. Okay, now here's the thing. Any condition, therefore, that is against the essence of Islam is invalid. And then, therefore, if it contradicts Islam, and what basically it considered as the definition of a certain thing, then in that situation, that would be invalid. And therefore, even if both sides consented, that doesn't change the fact that it goes against Islam and that it is not basically accepted by Islam, even if two sides consented. people's consent, whether it's a husband, wife, or people's consent, it does not go beyond the definition of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has considered. Just keep that one in mind. Who basically lays out the validity, or let's say the nullification of something? It's basically Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's what it means to say Allahu Akbar. What it means to say Allahu Akbar is that you regard as a Muslim that there's no one, not you, not I, not even the whole human mankind basically uniting together, that they would not nullify what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had regarded as permissible, or what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had regarded as impermissible. Nothing goes beyond Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, period. Okay, now some scholars considered that if we're talking about these contracts and they have these invalid conditions, that the marriage contract itself is invalid. And we did discuss that thoroughly last time when we talked about the types of marriage contracts in terms of their validity, and we said there's Sahih, valid, batil, or invalid, and there's a third kind which the Hanafi madhab had regarded, which they called fasid, or pseudo invalid, and we went in details with that one. Not going to go over it again, so just want you to see that the scholars that considered that those types of conditions that may be at least the invalid conditions, some scholars actually considered, well, since it's an invalid condition that is in this marriage contract, some scholars actually, especially the Hanafi madhab, they said, well, you know what, that's going to cancel out the madhab itself. That's going to cancel out the marriage itself. The other scholars, they said, well, not necessarily cancel the marriage contract, but the condition itself is invalid. Just wanted you to see that one right there, and I guess put it within that context and how we understand it. Let's see. So number 3 types of contracts are basically the conditions that Islam was idle on. So when you say idle on, you basically are talking about scholars, or at least Islam within the text. There wasn't a specific text that had contradicted that those types of conditions are valid or not valid, but left it to both sides to consent or not consent and accept to basically compromise. So now we're talking about compromising. What does that look like, and what does that even mean in terms of those areas of accepting or not accepting? What does that even look like? Okay, now that's where the ijtihad comes in, and that's where the huge debate between scholars happened. Those areas that Islam was idle on, and sometimes, just a note, just put it a footnote on the side, some scholars may disagree on certain details that Islam was idle on, and some would classify that as contradicting the essence of Islam, and some would classify it as not contradicting the essence of Islam. So it depends on how they had viewed it sometimes, and that's where, you would have this debate, how and where does this actually fit within these whole conditions? Is it part of what Islam was idle on? Is it part of what Islam was completely in disagreement with, because it goes against the essence of marriage in Islam, or etc.? Or is it something that goes with the essence of marriage in Islam because of the whole part and piece that both are consenting? Okay, now when you see these debates right there, I was just going over just before class. It's called al-Mawsu'a al-Fiqhiyya al-Kuwaitiyya. It's a very, very good encyclopedia on fiqh. Absolutely love it. And I'm going to show it to you right now. Let me see if I can. I think this is it right there. I was actually going over it. A very, very organized book. It's actually, I believe, in 47 or 48 volumes, or perhaps, I don't know if they went even 50, because at the time when I was a student, they were basically at 46 So they were still not done. And more was actually written, but I want you to see right there and how they go in these beautiful details. So who was subsidizing this work? We're talking about huge volumes right there, almost 50 volumes. Okay, and that was the Kuwaiti government. That's who subsidized all this work. And they did an outstanding job because this encyclopedia goes in a, kind of like alphabetically, matter by matter and issue by issue. And what's so beautiful about it is that they would discuss all the madhab. And in complete short, they'll basically make, let's say they're talking about conditions in marriage contracts, and they'll say, well, the differences of opinions, the different points, and in complete summary, to not go into all the details. And they'll give you in the footnotes, they'll give you basically the references for you to basically go and discuss that. Now, why am I even mentioning that? Just wanted you to see it right there. The translation that you might get off Google is not necessarily the best in regards to fiqh, to be honest. I think ChatGPT and AI was doing a better job in making some, let's say, translations on some issues of fiqh, but still, it definitely is not necessarily that accurate. So just wanted to note that, because I know, we get so excited in getting into these big references, and sometimes we're like, what, I want to go to Ummahat al-Kutub, and I want to see, these these resources, and be able to study fiqh in a thorough way by going to these big books and all of that. Just wanted to note, in order to really go back to these references, you really got to know Lugha Arabiya. That's a key thing. You really, really got to be really good in Lugha Arabiya. And it's not enough to know Lugha Arabiya, but you also have to recognize that there are certain fiqh terminologies that are extremely important for you to really, I guess, have a background in studying fiqh, to make sure you're not misunderstanding things as a literal interpretation and not necessarily a technical one. Okay, let me give you an example. The conditions that Islam was idle on and may have some benefit for one side and maybe perhaps not the other. These conditions are generally the conditions that Islam did not necessarily forbid, and does not contradict the main wisdom behind Islam in, let's say, marriage. And that's what Islam considered as permitted. But you want to keep in mind that these conditions may later on have certain implications on the marriage contract we're going to later see. But let's see, what do you mean by conditions that Islam was idle on? Let's say she put a condition not to leave the US or not to leave India or a certain state, that he would not get married to a second wife, or perhaps maybe be able to continue working or continue her education, or perhaps maybe other things that are important to her. Now, here's the thing. Majority of the scholars, they considered that such conditions are not necessarily obligatory to abide by, and they considered, now I want you to keep this one in mind, please pay attention. Majority of scholars, they considered that that's not necessarily obligatory to abide by, because they considered the general wording. Remember, كل شرط ليس في كتاب الله. They said, well, this is not a condition in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, how did they understand it? Well, they understood every single condition that's not in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They understood it as a condition that the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not note. The other scholars, specifically in the Hanbali madhab, they said, well, no, that's not what we understand in what this text is referring to as كل شرط ليس في كتاب الله. They said, we understand it differently. We understand it that a condition that contradicts the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether in the essence or whether in the details, if it contradicts the essence or the details of Islam, that's when it would be haram. But if it doesn't contradict the essence, then in that situation, if both sides agree on it and the man agrees on it, well, then religiously, he should, as another hadith says, that the most important conditions that you would abide by are the conditions, the conditions that you had regarded the private parts as lawful. So in other words, they considered that that's an evidence to prove that just because these conditions were not in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that doesn't mean that those conditions are basically contradicting Islam. They said, no, the husband is supposed to be abiding by these conditions and that it becomes something that is incumbent upon him to basically be committed to. So the Hanbali scholars, they considered these conditions as valid and that the husband must abide by these conditions. At the same time, like I said, most scholars consider that these conditions are not valid. The only time that they consider that they would be valid is when he makes these conditions, but making an oath by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when you say making an oath by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what are you actually talking about? So you're talking about him saying, by Allah, I will, let's get one of these conditions. I will not get you out of the US and we will stay living in the US, for example, and so forth. All right. So in that situation, does that make that as an oath, or is that a condition that puts the marriage in jeopardy? Well, here's the thing. If this was an oath, then he can just pay the kafarat al-yamin, or the expiation of oath, and basically say, well, I'm going to pay the expiation of oath because I had promised this and this, but that doesn't mean that the marriage contract itself is nullified. This is an oath, but that doesn't make it, according to those scholars. That does not affect the marriage contract. And of course, if he makes a second one, now that one makes it even more dangerous. And he swears that if he does not abide by these conditions, that the marriage contract would basically be considered as nullified. In other words, she would be divorced. That's a big problem. If he were to make this, well, that would mean that he's making a condition to end the marriage. I personally do not recommend making a condition like that because you never know the circumstances at the time. But at the end, people have certain preferences. I've got my preferences. You might have yours. And I think it's really important to, when you want to do counseling, I think it's very important to respect people's experiences, people's preferences, people's priorities. And I'm not going to put what I consider as my priority as somebody else's and basically, recommend it for them and consider that that's what you would have to do. So I'll respect that people have their situations, their circumstances, and certainly their priorities. And I'll just say my priority is, going at least with what Islam would consider is keeping a marriage is more important than perhaps keeping a certain condition on a side, because if you're jeopardizing your marriage for probably a side condition, but again, we're just letting you know of this. Now, the Hanbali considered, like I said, that these conditions are supposed to be abided by, and here's their defense. Okay, they considered that they're supposed to be halal, and any condition that basically is not contradicting Islam, then if both parties consent, then it should be halal, and there's nothing that can object to it. Ibn Taymiyyah was one of those scholars that considered that, well, these are part of actions, just like in any contract that you might do. And by these conditions, you basically set another condition upon yourself, and therefore you basically have to abide by it. Because if two areas and two sides, they're basically saying, well, this is what's important to me, and the other side is saying, well, you know what, if that's important to you and to you, you would not get into this marriage unless I would respect this matter for you, then therefore I basically have to respect it because that was the basis that you had accepted to get married, then therefore I have to respect it. And therefore I have to be committed to it. So that was the Hanbali madhab. That was the Hanbali madhab. And of course, their evidence was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu awfu bil-uqud. They said, well, here's another evidence. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Ma'idah, telling the believers to be committed by the conditions in the marriage and the contracts, not the marriage contracts, but the contracts in general. And if you're asked to do that commitment to a condition that you put on yourself in a contract that you probably bought something in a sale transaction or different kinds of transactions. Well, certainly when we're speaking about the different ayat, awfu bil ahdi innal ahda kana mas'ula, the Quran telling you that it is part of religious integrity that you would be committed to all the different promises that you would make. And the Prophet ﷺ described even the hypocrite, and he said, إِذَا حَدَّثَ كَذَبَ وَإِذَا وَعَدَ أَخْلَفَ وَإِذَا أَتُمِنَ خَانَ, that a hypocrite, if they say a word, they would lie, and if they وَعَدَ أَخْلَفَ, if they promise, they would break their promise. If they speak, they would lie, and if they were trusted, they would betray. He said, well, how is that different if we're talking about a marriage contract? It basically goes with it. So whether you made a condition in a marriage contract or whether you made a condition on a sale agreement, or whether you made a condition on other things, if it's a condition, you should be trusted. You should be a person that would abide and live up to the word. And it doesn't have to be basically in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or in the hadith to say, yes, this is a condition, this is what you have to do, because there would be, according to the Hanbalis, they basically said, well, it would make no sense to speak about conditions if anyways, it's like, yeah, I'm making a condition that he would have taqwa. Well, that's already in the marriage contract. That's already part of Islam. That's already this. But the conditions were supposed to be there to make people's lives easier and take in consideration what's important to them. Now, that's basically the Hanbali madhab. But then, of course, the other scholars, they said, well, there is a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said, مَا بَالُ رِجَالٍ يَشْتَرِطُونَ شُرُوطًا لَيْسَتْ فِي كِتَابِ اللَّهِ من اشترط شرطا ليس في كتاب الله فهو باطل شرط الله أحق وأوثق. Okay, there's actually a story behind this. And the story was Sayyidah Aisha had a slave girl. Her name was Barira. Okay. Now, Barira, she was, of course, later freed, but to make the story short, the people that owned her before, they basically had put a condition that she would still, abide by their requests. And in other words, she's sold by them, but then she has to still be committed to them. That makes no sense, because if she was sold by them, that means she would pay at least the obedience and owe the obedience to her new master. So that's when the Prophet ﷺ said, ما بال رجال يشترطون شروطا ليس في كتاب الله. Why do some men put conditions in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Whoever puts a condition not in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is invalid. Allah's conditions are the most important conditions. In other words, they're prior to any other condition. Now, just like I said, it was basically this story about Barira that basically was the reason for the revelation, or for not revelation per se, but for the reason why the Prophet ﷺ mentioned this hadith. Now, having that being said, When you see these conditions, or even inputting extra conditions that are not in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or at least the people are agreeing to compromise and accept it, that's that place of debate. But I actually thought that wasn't enough to give the opinion for al-madhhab al-hanbali, and I came across a really good article that I thought it would be good to share it with you. Okay, I'm going to share it with you right there, because I want you to, let's say right there, okay, want you to see it, because it really helps to see these articles. And instead of looking for detailed articles and so forth, it would be a good idea to just basically, go directly to it. And let me, instead of, making in thorough investigation, someone else probably did a thorough investigation and basically, just laid it out for you and made it easy. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you, here we go. Okay, I'm going to give you, when I tried to do the translation on the spot, unfortunately, it didn't give me the right lining. So I'm just going to give you right there. Okay, here we go. Right? This is it. So I'm going to give you two things right there. This is the English side of it. This is basically the translation. And this is the website Islam Web. But they actually did this thorough, I guess, this thorough article that was in response to basically speaking about the conditions, but I loved how they summarized the whole thing about conditions, and I wanted to basically lay it out for you. And I put the English side of it because when I tried to basically put the English translation directly on that page, I want to show you how it comes out as. When I put the translation to be like that, you ended up with, let me show you how it ends up, the lining of it basically goes way off, and then the sentences are really just not right. And that's why I basically decided to just go to AI, which will do a better translation and give me a more accurate translation. So I basically took it from there, and in order for you to actually see what I'm reading and not me, taking over the Arabic part. Okay, here we go. So in general, I'm just going to go over this article. In general, أحق الشروط أن توفوا به ما استحللتم به الفروج. I want you to look at this one. So in general, the Prophet ﷺ had basically said the most deserving conditions that are to be fulfilled are those by which you have made lawful the private part. When you see agreed upon, this is actually talking about Bukhari and the Muslim. I know the English side of it doesn't really give you an accuracy that this is a technical wording and a technical definition. So this is talking about that this hadith is actually on the highest level of authenticity because it was agreed upon to mean that it was narrated by Bukhari and Muslim, and not agreed upon between all scholars. Okay. So this is not a technical term to talk about agreed upon between all the scholars of different books or the different madhab. Okay, let's see the other quote. Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah, we just quoted him earlier. Let's see, he said, if this is basically, if good fulfillments in keeping the covenant is commanded, then it is known that the original principle is the validity of contracts and conditions. Since there's no meaning to validation except that which results in its effect and achieves its purpose. Basically wanted to say right there that, there's nothing that says that having a marriage contract is necessarily haram. If people are consenting and if there's nothing that in the religion that says that it's not permissible, then in that situation, it would stay within the parameter that this is valid and everything is supposed to be valid unless proven otherwise. So he's basically saying, hey, if in general you can put a promise upon yourself, and then in that situation, whether it's within a marriage or whether it's outside of that, then it should be okay. Okay, now here's the thing. When we're speaking about these conditions, they basically had laid out a couple conditions for these to be considered within the parameter that Islam was idle on. Remember when we said earlier, yeah, there are three types of conditions that Islam was idle on, conditions that Islam basically considered that they're contradicting the essence of the religion, in conditions that are part of the religion. Remember that piece of it? So yes, but I didn't really give all the different evidences. So that's where I want you to basically see all those evidences right there in order to go in thorough explanation in regards to this one. Okay, so the first one, that it should not basically contradict what the essence of the marriage, or at least what the essence of that type of contract in what the religion itself basically says, well, this is part of the essence of religion. Okay, number two, well, kind of goes within that idea, and which basically means that it does not contradict Islamic law. So it doesn't contradict Islamic law. Where's that coming from? This hadith, which you could say the hadith that we said, the story about Barira, and this story about Barira, here's the hadith that we basically had said earlier, when the Prophet ﷺ basically said any condition that is not in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is invalid, even if there are 100 conditions. Here's another one. Even if there are 100 conditions, then therefore they would not be considered as valid, and the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is more deserving to be followed. You can say where they just said Muslim, but that doesn't mean just Muslim on its own. It basically means it's narrated by the scholar. His name is Muslim ibn, Muslim al-Samarqandi, basically. Okay, and that's basically the second most reliable after al-Bukhari as a reference, and certainly according to the Malikis, it's actually considered even more important than Bukhari. Just a note. Number three is that there would be a benefit. There would be a benefit for either side. There we go, that it would go in the interest of the contracting party. I want you to look at this one. So when you're looking at there would be an interest, maybe I should actually right there, they should have, let's say right there, that it would be in interest of the contracting party. So what are we talking about? Interest, the man or the woman, or whose interest? So at the end is that it basically would be serving their interest, but there's one thing that we're going to go in details about when you say serving one interest or serving somebody's interest. What is that supposed to mean? Who determines whether this is basically something that is considered as fair or not fair? What is the level that we would consider that it is basically within the parameter of conscionable, or whether it is not or unconscionable? So what does that mean? It's like, oh, well, it's not fair. Who determines whether it is fair or whether it is not fair? And what is the amount of when we speak about whether it's fair or not, because we're looking at somebody's interest. Simply, if we're considering one side of interest, then the other side will say, well, I'm sorry, but that's not considering my needs. You accepted, though. You accepted, you compromised. At the time of the marriage contract, you accepted, and therefore we're just going to consider that you consented. Or is that necessarily the case? When will we consider that these contracts or these conditions are basically within the parameter of being having the conscience, basically, what is fair? We're going to talk about that in detail in just a bit. Okay, let's look at this quote right here for al-Buhuti. Let me just tell you about al-Buhuti. Al-Buhuti is basically a Hanbali madhab. There's no question about that. And al-Iqna' is basically, it's not, well, it's al-Buhuti al-Kashaf. It's almost in 8 volumes. Okay, and let's say he said شرط ما تنتفع به المرأة من مال لا ينافي العقد كزيادة معلومة في مهرها أو نفقتها الواجبة. أشار إليه في الاختيارات أو اشتراط كون مهرها من نقد معين، أو تشترط عليها أن لا ينقلها من دارها أو بلدها، أو أن لا يسافر بها، أو أن لا يفرق بينها وبين أبويها، أو أن لا يفرق بينها وبين أولادها، أو على أن ترضع ولدها الصغير. Okay. And then etc. So what does that even mean if we're looking at these conditions where it's a benefit for one side, but the other side is not necessarily benefiting from it, but he's going to be at least needing to compromise? Let's look into this. So he said the second is stipulating something from which the woman benefits that does not contradict the contract, such as a known increase in her dowry or her obligatory maintenance. We're talking about, a certain amount of money, etc. And he indicated that in so okay, indicated that, or stipulating that her dowry be in specific currency, or that she stipulates that he does not move her from her home or country, or he does not travel with her, or does not separate her probably between her and her parents, or does not separate her from her children perhaps, or that she would nurse the child, etc. So she's basically asking for these types of conditions. And of course, he said, well, these conditions, they're basically right there, certainly benefiting one side, but the other side is probably not going to be benefiting much, because if you're talking about there's an increase in mahr, in the amount that he would basically pay, hey, I want you to pay in, let's say, I don't know, English pound, okay, and I don't want it to be in British pound, or what's it called? I mean, in Egyptian pound. There's a huge difference. And to say, I want it to be this number and in this currency, or I want it to be in this house, this area, or let's say this neighborhood, which might be a very classy neighborhood and very expensive neighborhood. But hey, he agreed and he basically accepted. So, of course, that may mean that he's going to be paying extra, or probably going to affect him differently. Okay, now that's basically what, for that condition, the scholars that considered that, hey, there's a condition you accepted, and therefore you would have to abide by it. Okay, now here's one thing. When we're looking at this, it's important to consider that this quote right there. All right, so these in general, according to the Hanbali, that these conditions in general are supposed to be sahih. In other words, the condition itself is valid and therefore lazimun lizawja. What does it mean that lazimun lizawja? It means that it's a binding condition. In other words, that it's a valid condition, and it's a condition that he basically has to abide by, and therefore she would have the right to stay within the perimeter of marriage or decide to leave if the condition is not met. Because when she got into this relationship, to her, she made it clear that I would get into this relationship if you consider 1, 2, 3 issues for me, because these issues are extremely important to me. And of course, the evidence is, they said, well, أن رجلا تزوج امرأة وشرط لها دارها ثم أراد نقلها فخاصموه إلى عمر فقال لها شرطها، فقال الرجل إذا يطلقنا، فقال عمر مقاطع الحقوق عند الشروط. And okay, let's see what happened. A woman got married to this woman, but she had put a condition that he would not let her leave her household. And if he needed to leave, then, hey, I'm only accepting this marriage if you were to respect that I don't want to go out of my home, and that she would stay in it. Then he later, yes, a man got married to a woman. Oh no, a woman got married to a man. Okay. Then my son corrected a statement that I said. Okay, then of course, he wanted to later basically move her out. He didn't want her to stay within that household. And then they got into a dispute. She said, well, no, that's not what we agreed on. And then they went to Umar ibn al-Khattab, and Umar ibn al-Khattab said, لها شرطها. She has the right to basically have her condition respected. So then the man said, you know what, fine, let's just separate and bring about a resolution and end to this marriage. So Umar ibn al-Khattab basically said, well, at the end, people's rights, they basically are within the perimeter of the condition. So in other words, if you don't abide by the condition, then in that situation, that's going to basically put people's rights at risk right there. And here's one thing. They actually debated, first of all, remember that there is something that we discussed yesterday, which is a Sahabi's opinion and a Sahabi's statement. Is that an evidence? Is that a reference that we can use as evidence to prove something or not? And then whether it becomes as a reference, just like Quran and Sunnah, or not. And then they went in debate, what if there were other Sahaba that contradicted this or disagreed with it, and so forth. Just wanted you, and if you were there in the class of tafsir yesterday, you should be able to remember what we talked about yesterday in that regards, but don't want to go in details with that. Just want you to see these debates and how deep they go in discussing these issues. But then there's another debate. Well, how do I understand this whole debate itself? Okay, let's see right there. I want to see how they translated this. She has her condition, the man said. Of course, we're translating the quote. Then the man said, they will divorce us. Umar said, the rights are suspended when conditions are made. And because he stipulated for a benefit intended, that does not prevent the intended purpose of marriage. So it's basically abiding. Okay, let's see. Now, here's one thing. If we're talking about this condition, does that mean that ends the marriage? Or does that mean she would have the right to suspend the marriage? Or who does that? Or does that mean that the second that he says, well, I'm not abiding by it, that makes the marriage contract basically nullified? What does that look like? Now, here's one thing. I do recognize that at the time when a marriage contract is done, at the time when the marriage contract was done, the circumstances were completely different. The circumstances in terms of children now are basically present. Before, they were not present, and the situation was completely different. And same thing, even when the man accepted this condition, the circumstance was probably completely different. You need to. All right. So for both sides, at the time when the man compromised, the situation was probably completely different. And at the time that she put it as a condition and was willing to not accept this marriage was completely different. Right now that children are involved, certainly the circumstances are different. So that's what we're trying to look at right now. Now that the man is choosing to abide or not abide by these conditions, what happens to the marriage contract according to the Hanbalis? Because we know that the other scholars in the other madhahib, they basically consider that these contracts, they are not necessarily obligated on the man to fulfill. Yes, it would be good, thank you very much, but they didn't consider it as obligatory, period. But the Hanbalis, they regarded that no, you have to abide by them because these conditions are basically halal and part of any relationship between two basically sides in an agreement, and the other person accepted on this condition. So therefore, it is part of the generalized statements in the different ayat, in the different hadith that asked you to be committed to what you had promised. And there's no difference whether we're speaking about a marriage contract or a marriage condition, or whether we're speaking about a condition or or another type of contract. In fact, when we're speaking about marriage contracts, those are even a stronger bond. So what is the implication if the husband chooses not to abide by this condition? Number one, they generally said, well, it is incumbent upon the husband to basically abide by these conditions, and therefore he's obligated to fulfill it according to the soundest opinion. Basically, we're speaking about the Hanbali in this regards, and therefore the Prophet ﷺ had basically said, al-Muslimuna ala shurutihim, as in hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, that the Muslimin or the Muslims are basically bound by their conditions. In other words, you really have to live up to the word that you had put upon yourself. You got to be committed. You cannot betray. And that's basically including marriage contracts, any other contract, and therefore to somehow make as marriage, I don't have to abide by that. That basically makes it not fair and certainly a form of betrayal. So that's what the Hanbalis regarded. Let's see. Yet, and of course, although majority of the Hanbali scholars, they considered that, but you still had some other scholars, even from the Hanbali madhab. Let's see right here what al-Buhuti says. Well, not al-Buhuti, that one's, let's see right there in what he says in al-Kashaf al-Qina'. Let's see, he says, وَلَا يَجِبُ الْوَفَاءُ بِهِ أي بالشرط الصحيح بل يسن الوفاء به لأنه لو وجب لأجبر الزوج عليه ولم يجبره عمر بل قال لها شرطها. All right. Now, you had later Hanbali scholars, they basically said, well, it's not necessarily obligatory for him to abide by it, but it is basically, it's a valid condition. It's recommended if he fulfills it, because if it were obligatory, that is upon the husband, then he would have been forced to do it by law. And Umar, that in the story when he basically said previously, when we were talking about Umar ibn al-Khattab, that he basically just said, well, Umar did not force him to abide by the condition. He just said, well, it's her condition, and therefore you just have to respect her condition. And then therefore, basically, your other option is to go for a marriage resolution. Did Umar ibn al-Khattab say, well, you promised that and you're going to have to abide by it, and if you don't abide and you don't stay committed with your word and the condition, then I'm going to force you to probably pay an amount of money or probably imprison you or whatever it is. He didn't say that. He just said, well, that was still her condition and you just have to respect it. And if you don't want to, then, she has the right to leave. Okay. Let's see the other one, because this is quite interesting to actually say that it's not obligatory, but it is recommended that he would abide by it. That's also within the Hanbali madhab. Okay, let's say the other al-Badri, who's also Hanbali. Now, again, why am I discussing the Hanbali? Because the other scholars anyways consider that these conditions are anyways not conditions that are obligatory anyways, okay? So this is within the Hanbali madhab. So now I need to go within that parameter that somehow has, let's say, a conversation or some details in that regard. So I wanted to discuss this one. Okay. And of course, Ibn Habib is Maliki, not Hanbali, but he said, استحب مالك غيره من أهل العلم أن يفي لها بما شرط وأن ذلك غير لازم للزوج وعليه جمهور الفقهاء. Now, here's one thing. You also wanted to say, well, Malik majority of the scholars, they basically considered that that it is preferable for him to fulfill what he stipulated, and that it is not obligatory for the husband. And this is the majority of the scholars. So here's the thing. So if you're saying, yeah, we recommend you abide by it, or you say you're obligated and therefore at least religiously you'll be held accountable for not fulfilling the promise that you had made, what does this look like? What does this even mean? And of course, we don't have a single scholar that said that he would be imprisoned until he would abide by it. But they said, well, the second option is that she would have the right to basically ask for the qadi, not herself, but the judge, to basically end the marriage contract. So she would have the right to basically annul the marriage. Yes, she would have the right to annul the marriage and raise it to the judge. And then the judge himself would look into the conditions. Did you apply the conditions? This is what she agreed to marry you for. This is what you had put upon yourself as a condition. If you don't abide by it, then I'm sorry. If she insists to basically say, I don't want this marriage anymore because this is to me is more important, then in that situation, the qadi or the judge will basically intervene in that situation and annul the marriage or end the marriage. Let's say, البهوتي right there انكشاف القناع basically says فإن لم يفعل أي لم يفي الزوج لها بشرطها فلها الفسخ. That's basically what he's saying. لما تقدم عنهما لأنه شرط لازم في عقد فثبت حق الفسخ بترك الوفاء به كالرهن والضمين وحيث قلنا تفسخ فبفعله ما شرط ألا يفعله لا بعزمه عليه. I want you to look at this one. This is extremely important. These are really, really important words right there. So what did he say? Al-Buhuti right there, a scholar from the Hanbali madhab, he says if he does not do it, that is, if the husband does not fulfill her condition, then she has the right to annulment based on what was previously mentioned regarding Umar, the story of Umar again. And because it is a binding condition in a contract, so the right to annulment is established by failure to fulfill it, like a pledge or a guarantor in sale. And where we say she has the right to annulment, it is because he does what he stipulated he would not do. Okay, he does what he stipulated, what he would not do, and not because he intends to do it, contrary to what he had stated. Okay, so we're talking about an actual contradiction. So in action, he didn't say, well, this is what I intend to do. But if he says, well, no, that's it. We're buying the ticket. We're leaving the country. And she says, but wait a minute. We agreed that we would not leave this country. And he says, that's it. I bought the ticket. We're going. So now we're going to say he had already taken action to contradict the condition that was put in the marriage contract. So she can then raise it to the qadi and say, hey, we had this condition. I don't want to leave this country. I don't feel safe living in the other country or whatever it is. Then in that situation, she would have the right to raise it to the qadi. The qadi will then say, okay, well, you want to basically bring a resolution to this marriage? She says, yes, I want to bring a resolution to this marriage. I don't want to go for this. I don't want to continue. So the qadi will do a fasakh. Let's say the man says, but I don't want a divorce. Says, yes, I understand you don't want to, but now the qadi will say, but I have the right to take over your wishes and basically take over in making sure that I look into these conditions. And since you had chosen not to abide by these conditions, that I as a qadi, regardless of what your preferences are, I as a qadi will come in and basically bring the resolution or an ending to this marriage. Okay, let's see. So in regards to this annulment in that situation, let's see what they also said. They said, ولا يصح فسخ في خيار عيب وخيار شرط بلا حكم حاكم لأنه فسخ مجتهد فيه فافتقر إليه كالفسخ للعنة والإعصار بالنفقة بخلاف خيار المعتقة تحت عبد لأنه متفق عليه. Okay, what is, these are really particular words. When a qadi would go to basically the books of fiqh and basically go to these the books of fiqh, this is what they're going to be basically taking in consideration as these quotes. And he said an annulment is not valid in the option of a defect and the option of condition without a judge's ruling, because it's an annulment that requires interpretation. So it needs him, like the annulment, it needs who? Meaning the judge. So like the annulment due to impotence and inability to prove maintenance, unlike the option of a freed slave, because it's agreed upon. Let me explain this one. In a situation where he does not abide, and she says, that's it, I don't want this, the qadi overseeing and making the evaluation is necessary. In other words, you're not, as a woman, that comes in to decide, that's it, we're ending this, and that's it. No, it doesn't go like that. We need a qadi to evaluate the condition, evaluate the circumstance, evaluate the details in order to make the final statement. And that it's not, oh yeah, that's it. You know what? Since you're not accepting this, I'm not going to continue with this. And that's it. I'm ending it. Now you're divorced. No, it doesn't go like that at all. No scholar said that that's how it goes. Therefore, we would need a qadi to make the final statement after reviewing it. Why? Because it needs interpretation. We need a scholar. We need a judge to evaluate the condition, to evaluate the situation, and evaluate basically the details and look into those conditions and then determine whether he is going to be obligated / forced into abiding by that condition, or whether a resolution is the only option. Not that she would take it upon herself and say, that's it, you know what, I'm going to do it my way. I'm going to go to American courts, civil courts, and I'm going to end it my way. Then in that situation, you had actually cut corners that Islam did not tell you that that's the way that would be permissible to do it in. You want a mujtahid, you want a scholar to basically determine if those conditions are basically to be fit for nullifying the marriage based on that scholar and based on his evaluation or not. Just keep that one in mind. And certainly an American non-Muslim judge is not going to be the same as, of course, with his mindset, with his evaluation, with all of that, as a Muslim judge who considers certain essence of what Islam would consider as a priority. They come from a completely different vision, a completely different mindset, a completely different legal maxim, and certainly a completely different vertebra. So just to let you know, I'm laying things out, whether, whether you may consider another madhab or not, just laying it out for you and letting you see these quotes to help you know what might be coming up or how scholars would review all of this. Okay, let's see. Let's see right there. And if we're talking about what if she basically was put in this situation? Let's give an example. He tells her, he tells her that he would accept that she would get a job. They had a baby, but this baby turned out to have Down syndrome. And the husband thought, you know what? I know I put a condition that you would get a job and that you would work and that I have to respect that. But right now that we have a child with Down syndrome, our circumstances are going to be completely different. I don't feel safe putting my child, even if he has Down syndrome, I don't feel safe putting my child basically with nannies or within an institution to basically abuse his circumstances, that he basically has a disability, and I would like that you quit your job and take care of our son. She said, well, wait a minute, that's not what we agreed on. That's not what we agreed on. So then he basically further continues to explain to her the importance of considering this disabled child and making sure that he too is basically taken care of. And then later on, she basically says, okay, I'll basically compromise and I'll let go of this condition that I had put in the marriage contract. Or let's say she didn't necessarily say it verbally, but she went on, basically resigned from her job, accepted to move on with her life. Then she later raises this matter and she says, well, now he's 9 years old. He's capable of talking, is verbal. He's capable of saying when somebody abuses him. He's capable of saying that, hey, something happened and I would like to go back to work. Then comes in the debate. Then the husband says, well, you accepted not to work for a long time. You can't raise this again. And she says, well, wait a minute. I accepted because the child, he was not verbal and we were concerned about his safety. Now that he's verbal, I'd like to go back to what we had accepted in the condition. Then that's when that debate again rises between scholars. Number one, her compromise, whether verbally, is going to be basically considered as, okay, she let go of a condition. Now the condition, she let go of it. Or whether in action to mean she basically moved on with her life, even though he did not abide by it. She basically decided to move on with her life and just accept it as is. It's like, okay, whatever. And decided to at least compromise in that situation. Does that mean that, hey, she accepted on a condition that the child would be, we would wait until he is verbal, or we would basically on that condition, we let go entirely, meaning that, hey, she would not work and that she gave up on that working part. That's when there would be basically this debate between scholars, at least within this area, and look into the circumstance. Was that conditional or was that not conditional? In general, if someone agrees, whether verbally or whether in action, to give up on a condition or give up on their rights, usually you cannot come back to it if you compromised already. Usually you cannot go back to it. It becomes the new condition that you decided to give up on. I'm just letting you know these areas because I know they actually, come in. Here's what I also did. I thought, you know what? Prenuptial agreements. And I thought, well, let me do what someone else might do and basically go to ChatGPT and ask ChatGPT what ChatGPT would think of prenuptial agreements and all of these things. And because I know that women are going to go to basically discuss that with basically ChatGPT and then see what prenuptial agreement looks like. How do we understand this? And all of that is basically becomes most people's go-to in order to understand some things. So I thought I would just lay out, before I would get all these flowing questions in regards to prenuptial agreement. And I thought, you know what, let me lay out the legal prenuptial agreement based on really fast what ChatGPT would want to tell me, and then talk about each and every single one of these from the Islamic standpoint and whether Islam would agree with that or not agree with it. Now, here's one thing. When we're speaking about prenuptial agreements, we will be talking about more details in regards to financial rights. Does she have the right to work? Does she have to give part of her income and contribute within the marriage? We'll talk about that later on. Okay, but for the time being, we're basically just going to lay out a couple things because we're talking about conditions. Okay, so in regards to prenuptial agreements, we're talking about legally they're asked to fully disclose basically both sides, whether we're speaking about income or whether we're speaking about assets, debts, financial obligations, and so forth. If any of them hides any of this information, it becomes invalidated basically in court. Now, here's the thing. Of course, in Islam, prenuptial agreements or the conditions is not necessarily only in money, but it would also be in stay. It would be in whatever is important to her. Could be about her children, can be about, well, I don't want to be away from my kids who I share custody with my ex or whatever it is. So to her, this is important to stay within a certain area because she wants to be next to her children. Or perhaps maybe she has another condition that's important to her. It was her dream to study, etc. So it doesn't have to be necessarily within money alone. So this disclosure of all the different details about money, this is in situations where money is involved, where you would have to disclose this basically asset or probably the income, the debt, etc. So if both wanted to share, let's say income or share basically money, all of that in Islam, just because someone got married, that doesn't mean that all their money becomes under ownership of their spouse. And certainly that's the same thing, I'm sure, legally. Your money does not become your spouse's money just because you got married. But, of course, there can be certain divisions or certain ways in a case of a divorce, not in the money that was made prior to the marriage, but the money that was made during marriage. We'll talk about that later. The money that was made during marriage, how would that be a fair distribution between the husband and the wife and so forth? Okay, now the voluntary and free consent. So number 2, the agreement must be signed willingly. And we're talking about, of course, in a legal prenuptial agreement. Okay, but in Islam, does it necessarily have to be signed? Well, one thing to say is that during our time, the Islamic courts will take in consideration the different legal methods and the different legal systems. So even an Islamic court would look into a lot of the conditions that you would have in legal documents. Where's the signature? Where are the witnesses? Where's the seal on this contract? Or probably they might actually ask might even ask for it to be perhaps maybe approved by a certain ministry or whatever it is. Or perhaps maybe that there would be a notary, that it would be notarized, all of these different things. It may be considered by the Islamic court. I know you might say, but it's not the case in the books of fiqh. Yes, it's not the case by the books of fiqh, but the whole system of canonizing and making things in a system of like a legal system was actually done mainly by Uthmani Khalifa. His name is Sulaiman al-Qanuni. He was the first one to decide and his book, it was really based on the Hanafi madhab, and he basically decided to canonize fiqh in order to make sure that the scholars of fiqh, or at least the judges, are not in any way probably bribed or probably taking wrong decisions or wrong rulings on different matters. He decided to, well, with Abu Saud Effendi, he decided, well, let's canonize all those cases and put them in a book where it's canonized like a think of it as a constitution, to make sure that people's rights are considered and that these judges do not basically go off track with what is considered as people's rights. So we need to, according to him. So later on, the scholars of fiqh, they had to basically abide by these legal ways of doing things. So you had, certainly they will say, well, I need a seal, I need a witness, I need a stamp, or I need this. So certainly you will not find that in the books of fiqh, but it was later as a way to make sure that we have those conditions, we have those legal issues basically confirmed that it is valid, and confirmed that it basically is legal, that it holds basically authenticity and is genuine. So that's why you do have these conditions. But on a side, if let's say a husband and a wife, let's say in Bangladesh, they made a marriage contract and they didn't have, the woman didn't know that it needs to be signed or all of these things, and he managed to, brought the two witnesses, and the wali was there, they made a wedding and all of that, and he made these conditions and all of that, but then he abused the fact that she didn't know her legal rights. Abused the fact she didn't know her legal rights and basically knew how to twist all of that. That would be haram. That would be haram, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will hold them accountable. Just because a judge might rule based on what he sees on documents and based on what he knows or what he understands in terms of legality of something, and what he, in other words, by the book, that does not make it as necessarily not accountable by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So just because the constitution or the book or a qadi might have ruled in your favor, and you know that that's not what you had agreed on, and that's not what person to person, what the situation was, that's lacking integrity. And most cases basically play it that way. Unfortunately, we're living in a society that lacks integrity. Okay, now the other part about the conditions is that they're without pressure, coercion, threats, or manipulation. In order for us to consider that contract or that condition, number one, without pressure. Islam agrees with that. Absolutely. Coercion, threats, etc. Absolutely. Absolutely. There's the Prophet ﷺ actually said, إن الله تجاوز لي عن أمتي الخطأ والنسيان وما استكرهوا عليه. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had dismissed upon the ummah what they would commit by mistake, or by forgetting, or by coercion. So if a person was coerced to accept a certain condition or an agreement, then in that situation, they're not held accountable for it. Not only by Allah, but even legally. So if this person managed to prove that I was coerced to accept this, I was manipulated to accept this, this is what I was told. Sometimes this can be I guess, something that the qadi might believe in. Sometimes you can prove it, but other times it's basically you and you having to need to prove whether you were manipulated or whether you were coerced or whatever it is. And certainly it has to have a lot of integrity. Okay, let's see. Preferably signed well before the wedding date. Last minute signing a day or two before the wedding can invalidate it. So in Islam, not necessarily a last minute signing, as long as we're talking about a last minute signing or where we're talking about signing the prenuptial agreement, as long as during the marriage contract, that's what matters. A day or two, doesn't matter. Okay, independent legal signing for each party. If each one basically has their lawyer, in other words, at least they understand the Islamic ruling, or the ruling, or they understand the agreement fully. And if one basically does not have a legal counsel, etc., then in that situation, this can be an agreement that's unfair or invalid. Well, in Islam, basically tells you, you got to do your homework to learn your rights. All right. And in Islam, it tells you, well, you signed this. You should have done your homework beyond ChatGPT to make sure that you fully understand what this means. You probably decided that I don't want to pay for legal counsel and charge and, put an extra charge upon myself. I'll just accept it and that's it. Okay, well, sorry, but the law may not be in your favor. And at the end, you accept it to give up on your rights, then you're going to bear basically the responsibility. Fair and reasonable terms, unconscionable. Okay. Now, what is that? Basically, that if something is in favor to one side, but not considering the other person's favor, then in that situation, the qadi may look into it. And that's the same thing in Islam. If something is appearing that it is absolutely not fair for one side, even if both sides consented, but the qadi says, I'm sorry, but this is definitely not in favor or not considering somebody else's interest. That's definitely not something that I'm going to be approving of. So the qadi, even if both sides consented, the qadi may look into the situation and say, this is not fair. And basically, boom, basically reject it. By the way, this is a place of question, and that's just like in legal courts, or at least, I'll give you an example. Remember that guy that he's a soccer player, Moroccan guy, soccer player, I forgot what his name was. So he basically was married to this woman, and Hakeem, I don't know what his name was, but anyhow, so he was married to this woman. He had $70 million. And then when the woman divorced him, she basically ended up not getting anything. In fact, she had $6 million of her own. And of course, I believe it, I can't remember which government that was, that I think it was the Spanish government. I can't remember exactly which government it was, but they considered, since he had put all the money in his mom's name, that she doesn't get half of his assets. And in fact, she was legally owning the $6 million that she owned. Okay. And it was put in her name. So she ended up basically needing to pay half of the $6 million to this guy. Okay. Now, here's one thing. Just like in Western courts, in America, that would not pass like that, even if he put it under his mom's name. They would consider that as, well, this is not fair, and consider it that even if this was basically legally on papers, that was put in his mother's name, etc., that's not fair. And they would further investigate and consider, no, that was a game that you played, a legal game that you played. So that's where Islam would also consider that, no, not necessarily. I'm not saying half the assets and all of that. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about the details of how scholars might review and evaluate these conditions, or evaluate at least these, let's call it disputes. Okay, so if we're talking about a condition extremely one-sided, depriving one's basic rights, and we're looking at the time of signing, time of divorce, etc., then the qadi will look into it and see whether there was a manipulation, a game, a blackmail, what was actually behind all of this. The qadi will look into it. So, of course, that's why after Sulaiman al-Qanuni, that's when the conditions were asked to be written, and the most Islamic courts will tell you, I'm sorry, but we're not going to say and accept that the conditions, yeah, we were sitting together and this is what he promised me. We were during our moment of our engagement and he promised me to do this. I'm going to say, well, I'm sorry, do you have a written document? No, I don't. Even though Islamically, or at least with his taqwa, you gave her a word of promise, that should be something that you should abide by, and it doesn't have to be on paper. But in order for the qadi to have the right of making a marriage resolution, the qadi wants it written. The qadi wants it written, and not you and him sitting on the porch during your engagement, and your wali was somewhere within reach, and he said, yeah, I'm going to do this. I promise to be the nice, kind husband and let you finish up until your PhD and all of that. He promised me verbally. No, we want a written one in order for the qadi to say, okay, I'm going to do a fasakh based on the Hanbali madhab. So just keeping that one in mind, even a legal system will say, I want a written one, and an oral prenuptial agreements are not enforceable in all legal systems. Just to know, just why? You want to keep in mind, if you might say, well, how come Islam is this? I'll tell you, what, look at this. So you have to be aware when you make a prenuptial agreement, and you make these conditions, you have to understand that even legally, when you go through the legal system, they basically have the same way. They basically will tell you, I don't want a verbal thing or an oral agreement. We want a written notice. Must be signed in front of the witnesses, notary public, and all of that. And certainly, when we're speaking about these prenuptial agreements, this should not include things that would violate the law, or in Islam, basically violate the essence of Islam. To say, oh, no child support, or no custody for rights for any of the parents, basically to say, yeah, even if they're children, that he would basically agree to never have custody over the children, or that he must have a certain number of children, and we're going to have 5 children, and basically no more than that, etc. Well, I mean, I can't guarantee that, and I can't guarantee less, or I can't guarantee more, because we basically don't have that power. Okay, now that's what I wanted to basically cover for today, and I will just opening the doors for questions, inshallah. I know there's so much always to say every single time, but if there are any questions, and I know this is a hard topic to talk about for a number of different reasons. Number one is, okay, well, how can I force him to abide by this condition? That's a very important question. The yamin, he can just go and do kafarat yamin. And now you're saying these conditions, scholars had differences of opinions on whether he's obligated to abide by them or not. The best that they had said is, we would recommend him to abide by it, but and then if he doesn't abide by it, the best I can get is really just to raise it to the qadi, and then he'll evaluate it and probably decide to nullify, or probably, bring a resolution to the marriage and do fasakh. But I want to maintain my marriage, and I also want to maintain the condition. Well, that's that area that no guarantee. Just wanted you to know. No guarantee, because the circumstances cannot be guaranteed. And of course, right now, we don't have a government system that can enforce that as well. In fact, even when you saw Umar ibn al-Khattab, he just said, well, I mean, that was the condition. And then the option was, okay, so you want to leave, go ahead and leave. I know, it's so hard. It's so hard in all ways. But if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer it.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
My question is related to what you just said. So, like, what would you recommend for today's contract? So, would you say a verbal agreement is okay between couples, or do they have to like write it down, like have it notarized, just in case of future discrepancies?
You know, all of these things on paper, and even if you were to notarize it and legal documents and all of that, if somebody doesn't have the taqwa, to really be considerate, and especially during the time when, yes, definitely, there are people that are truly narcissists, truly manipulative, truly lacking deen and lacking integrity. I agree with that. But, you know, the best thing to really bet on is a person's taqwa. That's the best thing to bet on. And unfortunately, even if you're talking about written prenuptial agreements and all of that, you know, you want to maintain a marriage, but, you know, going through all these courts and court systems, and it drains you. It drains you fully. It drains the kids. It drains all sides. It drains the families. And some people are just so toxic. It's just so toxic. So my recommendation, before even marriage, do thorough investigation on this person's akhlaq, on this person's deen, because that's the best bet that you can hope that this person is going to be committed. But unfortunately, I had seen cases where, yes, they made these conditions and they made it seem like they followed the Hanbali's opinion in that regards, and then they all of a sudden flipped and said, oh, well, I don't agree with that, or I don't agree with that, or, you know, I got a scholar from the Maliki madhab who said that it's recommended, but not, and so all of a sudden flipped and started using these different cards to basically play this game and switch and flip from one opinion to another, from, you know, cherry picking the scholars that are in their favor. Just wanted to lay that out for you. But I don't really have, to be honest, I don't really have a way that can guarantee, one, the circumstances change. Number two, guaranteeing that, yes, this person's going to be abiding by the condition that you probably set. There's really no way to guarantee. So it ends up, these conditions are really just ink on paper for some. Yes. But what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had known, just know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will compensate you. You know, I just don't want you to just live betrayed all your life and feel that, hey, I was a victim of all of this, but it could be true. But I just want you to know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will compensate you. And yes, you certainly have the legal rights to seek to seek a resolution, or to seek, according to the Hanbalis, or to even seek basically your rights or a compensation. It's like, okay, you decided to break this agreement. I would like a compensation for this. And should you seek that? How do we seek that? And then at least that understand that he would understand that you're not giving up on it, and that I would always recommend. And that you would basically let him know that it's something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will hold him accountable for. You know, it's a situation that I know if you know, I don't know what to tell you. You know, how do we understand these conditions when even the scholars themselves debated this? Allah al-Musta'an. I know I didn't answer your question, dear, but you know, I just laid out the differences of opinions, laid all of that. You know, I guess prenuptial agreements are extremely important to basically perhaps the legal method of using these prenuptial agreements is probably better than using only the Islamic courts. This is probably my recommendation. Don't just do it at the masjid or the Islamic court. If something is really important to you, please use the legal system as well to make that a prenuptial agreement using the legal system. If it's important to you, that's the best way to ensure your rights basically being enforced in an authority that has the power to basically ensure what is important to you. That's the best way to do it. Other than that, it's going to be ink on paper. And then they could flip any minute and say, yeah, now I'm not following this madhab. And all of a sudden it's like, but you promised. What am I going to do now? Am I going to end the marriage, or what am I going to do? What am I going to choose? Definitely, you know, ayatul munafiqi thalath. So what about this family that I had invested for my kids, for right now, you know, for all these many years of marriage. Right now, I'm being put on the spot where I have to give up on something that was so dear to me. Maybe my home, maybe my children, maybe this. So you have to then decide on what is more important to you: the condition, the circumstance, the situation, all of these different areas. So that's for you to decide. All right. So سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نستغفرك ونتوب إليك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت. If there are any questions, I'd be, inshallah, happy to answer. If you would like to unmute yourselves. All right. I'm going to